Hi everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 2nd of February, where I wanted to finish up talking about Shakespeare and his time period and then transition over into some of the actual writings by Shakespeare. So last class, we talked a little bit about Shakespearean biography, some of the questions associated with whether or not authorship could truly be attributed to Shakespeare. And we also talked a little bit about the theaters themselves. I didn't really have a chance to talk about the politics of the time, though I believe I did mention that Queen Elizabeth was the monarch in place, and fortunately for us, she was a great supporter of the arts, which meant that she gave us the opportunity probably to read these plays now, because without her support, I don't know if these plays would have existed. Because at the time, theater going was viewed as a kind of unsavory sort of activity, and playwriting and acting was seen as a kind of unsavory occupation. But you don't argue with the queen. So ultimately, even though it might have been seen as unsavory, it was also very popular and embraced by all levels of society. Now, in terms of Queen Elizabeth, she was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. It's one of the things that we will talk about more when we get to the history section of Shakespearean plays. And this will be important because this means that she did not have a direct heir. In fact, she was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. And I can't attest to her sexual status, but this I can say that it was probably a politically motivated move on her part not to marry. Because if she had decided to marry, she would have lost the power and control that she had purely because she was a woman. And this gets us to the idea of the chain of being, that in society at the time, it was viewed to have a kind of hierarchy or ranking of all living things. And we could go from the lowest orders of animals and go all the way up to the highest, which would be God and his angels. And the idea is that there was a place or a ranking for each of these. And you would begin with God, and then, of course, different angels would have different ranking in the hierarchy. And then you would get to human beings, who were considered to be superior to animals because of their greater ability to reason. And within those human beings, the one at the top of the chain of being would be the king or the queen, the monarch. They would be viewed as basically God's mouthpiece on earth. And then the rankings would continue based on social status. So the higher the social status, the higher one would be on the chain of being. In terms of gender, male would be above female on the chain of being because it was viewed that men had a greater ability to reason. Adult before child, you get the idea. And some of these ideas still exist within our contemporary society. What was interesting about Shakespeare was that while he was writing in a time period that had a very established chain of being, he oftentimes critiqued that chain of being. Now, it needed to be done in a very safe way because it was a very open time to talk about sexuality, and it was a very open time to talk about violence. But it was not an open time to talk about politics. Saying the wrong thing politically could get you into quite a bit of trouble and could even lead to one's execution. So what we will see is that Shakespeare oftentimes embedded messages about the politics of his time and things such as the social ranking and hierarchy, the chain of being, that we need to dissect. And there was someone known as a master of revels. They served as a kind of censor to make sure that an individual wasn't a playwright, wasn't embedding in any kind of commentary that could be viewed as subversive. But again, Shakespeare was so clever with his wordplay, it wouldn't necessarily look subversive on the surface. You've got to dig beneath that. So Shakespeare very covertly oftentimes put questions about the established order of the time, as well as raised questions about the political situation of the time, as we will see with his writing. But first I wanted to talk about Renaissance language. And there was a lack of standardization, which I think I mentioned a little bit last class, in terms of Shakespearean biography. So you wouldn't necessarily have a standard of spelling, which would fairly easily explain why the handful of signatures that have been determined to be authentic by scholars for Shakespeare are spelled differently. And meanings of words definitely were changed over time periods. And that's pretty typical with language, is that language continually evolves. We know that Shakespeare created words, and we know that sometimes those words were never used again. And if you think about a word like die, D-I-E, which means the ending of life, let's say, or that would also be the singular of dice. That's what that's called, a die. One dice out of two. If we were to go to Webster's dictionary, we would probably find those two meanings. However, the word die had a very different meaning during the Renaissance. This is where we talk about resources such as the Oxford English Dictionary, which is considered to be the dictionary of all dictionaries because it tries to review all of the words that have been used in the English language. And this is a historical review. So you have multiple pages that are devoted just to one definition. And what you will have is how that definition was first established and then how it's changed over time with examples from pieces of literature, hence the length. When it used to be published in print, it looked much like one of those old encyclopedias with multiple volumes. And that's, again, necessary if you're going to get that detailed about definitions. And usually this is a superb resource if you're trying to look up the origins of a word or its historical usage. And I mention this in terms of understanding Shakespeare because sometimes his language would have been used differently during his time period than it would be in our time period. And I had suggested that if you're going to be using a text, I personally like the Riverside, but if you're going to be using a text or an online resource as well, that you choose something that has some footnotes that can assist you with trying to determine the meaning of things. But to get back to the word die, what it would have meant during Shakespeare's time, and it's no longer used in this way, is orgasm, which gives a very different sense to a line such as, I die upon your lap, which could all of a sudden be very bawdy and very sexual. And Shakespeare and his time period was very bawdy and very sexual. So I use this as an example of how I know that sometimes his language can be challenging and sometimes a little bit intimidating. And I have two videos I wanted you to see. If you look at the notes below, you'll see that section 2 is about Renaissance language. And one video, it's approximately 10 minutes or so, is about the original pronunciation versus the modern pronunciation. And as we established last class, there are probably more questions about Shakespeare and his time period and his biography than there are answers. There are also questions about how the words would be pronounced. And in fact, some scholars have determined that the modern day pronunciation that we have of Shakespeare's language wouldn't necessarily give us the sense of rhyme and meter that we would have based on the way that they believe the language would have been pronounced during the time period. So I think this is a very interesting video because you'll see examples of modern pronunciation as well as theories about the original pronunciation. And this might help explain some of the poetry that's embedded within Shakespeare. Sometimes there's poetry that doesn't necessarily rhyme, at least with modern pronunciation, but if we were to go with original pronunciation, it would rhyme. I also wanted you to watch another video about contemporary versus Renaissance language. And it's approximately 8 minutes or so. And it happens to be about how, as long as we understand the plot, then we could appreciate the language. It actually is a comedian who is doing a routine about the Three Little Pigs, but he performs the Three Little Pigs in Renaissance language. So chances are you probably have an understanding of the plot of the Three Little Pigs ahead of time. So if you do, then you probably will have a great appreciation for the language, with a little twist at the end. So I hope you enjoyed that. That's about 8 minutes or so. And I use that as an example to indicate that I know that your first reading of Shakespeare, the difficulty is understanding plots. But once you've got plot down, then you can really appreciate the nuances of the language and the wordplay that goes on. And the way that I wanted to initially introduce the language to you is through Shakespearean sonnets. And I had discussed that a little bit last class as well, that we believe that the bulk of the sonnets were written in times when the theater houses were closed for plague. And the sonnet, or at least the Renaissance sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet, has a very strict structure. It is 14 lines. It has a 10-syllable line. So if you were to take a very famous line, such as, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" you can break that down into beats or syllables. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And that beat would continue on through all of the sonnets. So you've got to have that beat, and you've got to have 14 lines, and it has to be about a topic that's considered suitable for the loftiness of a sonnet. So it's got to be a serious and important topic, something like life or death or beauty. It can't be about something that's too mundane. And there was also a particular rhyme scheme, and I believe I mentioned this last class as well, that basically the way we determine the rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern is that we look at the last word of each line. And if we begin with the first line, that last word, the first last word, so to speak, would be our first rhyme. And that would be indicated by the first letter of the alphabet, which is A. And any rhyme that occurred afterwards for that A rhyme would be labeled as an A as we look at the last words of each line. If you've got a new rhyme, then you go to the next letter of the alphabet, which happens to be B. And then anything that would rhyme with that B rhyme would be identified as a B. And a C and a D and so forth. And you're looking to see whether or not there's a pattern. And the sonnets have a very distinct pattern. A, B, A, B. C, D, C, D. E, F, E, F. And then finally G, G, the last two lines that rhyme together. So every other line. And if you think about the difficulties of being able to put together a 14-line poem that has a 10-syllable line, that has a particular rhyme scheme, then perhaps we can begin to appreciate some of Shakespeare's ability and facility with language. He wrote 154 of these sonnets. And again, probably during very challenging times. And again, that would have been in addition to his 30-plus plays. Now, the sonnets were not given titles, so we refer to the sonnets by either the first line in the poem, or we refer to the sonnets by their number. And what scholars have tried to do is to number them. And again, you know that this is as much up to dispute as everything else associated with Shakespeare. And they've divided the sonnets up into two major groups or categories. The early set of sonnets and the later set of sonnets. I suppose not too original. And the early set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron, somebody that Shakespeare wanted to flatter and to gain favor with. Then the later set of sonnets are thought to have been written to someone known as the Dark Lady. That this would be a woman that Shakespeare was at the very least infatuated with, at the very most was having an active affair with. And then she was known as the Dark Lady because of her features, specifically her hair color and her eyes, that they would be dark. This is less a commentary on skin and more commentary about skin and eyes. Or more commentary about hair and eyes. And this will be important when we read A Midsummer Night's Dream, because one of the characters is brunette, and the other character is blonde, and both of these women are vying for the love of, or the attention of various men. And we'll see what some of the stereotypes of the time are for beauty. And perhaps they still reinforce some of our current stereotypes in relation to beauty. So this the set of sonnets and its division, of course, could be up to dispute. Sometimes when you're reading a sonnet, it's very clear that it's written to a particular person, such as the young man or the dark lady. But other times you might be reading a sonnet and it's general enough that it could apply to a multitude of people. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the sonnets, is that they don't necessarily have to apply to a particular individual, so that we can use that sonnet and apply it to a particular situation or to a particular person if we so wanted to. We're not going to read all of the sonnets. We're just going to read 3 of the earlier ones and 3 of the later ones, so we can get just a little bit of a taste of some of what Shakespeare was doing within his sonnets. And in terms of reading the sonnets, usually at the time period, what poets did is they would write something called a sonnet cycle, which meant that all of the sonnets or the poems would tell one whole story. So they would have to be read in their entirety. And Shakespeare broke that and basically has each sonnet stand as an individual unit, which makes things much easier for us, in that we can just read a selection of sonnets and have them stand on their own, even though we will see parallels and themes within them. What I suggest you do when you are reading the sonnets in particular is that you read them out loud and you listen to the language. I suggest 3 readings. I always suggest 3 readings with all pieces of literature. The first for plot, the second for analysis, and the third just to refresh your memory before you're going to actually talk about the piece. And I understand that it may not be practical or possible to read, let's say, a Shakespearean drama 3 times. You might just be able to read it once, and even that might be a challenge. But certainly, the more frequently you're able to reread a piece, the more likely it is that you can identify the nuances and the details and the subtleties. But keep in mind that the sonnets are very short. They are not the length of a play. They are merely 14 lines. Once we're starting to deal with poetry, which is highly condensed, then it requires multiple rereadings because there's so much possibility of meaning within that compact space. Now, there are individuals who basically are professional readers, and you can listen to them read sonnets. There are also actors who have read sonnets, and you might be familiar with Sir Patrick Stewart, an actor who gained his fame during with Star Trek, The Next Generation, a television series. He has a wonderful voice, and he also is Shakespearean trained. What he ended up doing, and this would have been in the early days of the pandemic, is that he recorded himself reading a sonnet a day. And sadly, unfortunately, he ran out of sonnets before the pandemic was over. And I'm sure he didn't anticipate that, considering the number of sonnets that exist. But these were the early days of COVID, where we were talking about weeks rather than talking about months or years, which is the situation that we're in now. And you can see in the notes below, and this is in the 3rd section, that if you wanted to listen to Sir Patrick Stewart read his sonnets or read his interpretation, because readings are always interpretations of the sonnets, and I highly recommend that you do that because he has a wonderful reading voice, you can do so. But again, what I recommend you do is that you read it out loud and then you try to paraphrase it. You try to put in your own language what's happening within that particular sonnet. Then you reread it, and then you try to identify themes, and you identify elements of language, things like symbolism. In other words, representation, where one word is used to represent something else. More often than not, something concrete is used to represent something that's not concrete. So we think about some of the common symbols in our time. For instance, a flag is supposed to symbolize or represent patriotism. A flag is something concrete that we can see and touch. Patriotism is not concrete, so you can't necessarily see it or touch it, but we combine these 2 elements. Or metaphor, where you are comparing 2 dissimilar things, but not using the words like or as. If you are using the words like or as, then you're using a simile rather than a metaphor. Rhyme, which we were talking about earlier, where you are looking at the sounds of words. This would be the last word of each line if we are examining a sonnet, or the endings of the words. And do the endings of the words basically sound similar? But there's something called alliteration. Rather than looking at the endings of the words, we're looking at the beginnings of the words. And do the beginnings have similar sounds? Or something like imagery, something that is, again, representational, something that can represent something else. So in terms of the sonnets, I wanted to start with Sonnet 15, and then next class we could discuss the other sonnets. And I'm going to read Sonnet 15 out loud. I can't do it justice in the way that Patrick Stewart would do it justice, so I really do encourage you to listen to him. But Sonnet 15 reads, "When I consider everything that grows, holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the selfsame sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory. Then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night. And all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new." And again, with the first reading, you're probably not going to be able to get very much out of that particular sonnet. But read it a second time, or even a third time, or even a fourth time. And some things that I wanted you to pay attention with is the use of you or thee. Notice that oftentimes in the sonnets, a specific gender cannot be identified. This is going to be important when we talk about our next sonnet, probably Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, "Shall I compare thee or you to a summer's day?" And so it allows us to generalize in a way that we wouldn't if we were given a specific gender pronoun. Shakespeare likes to use vegetation imagery. He oftentimes talks about nature and growth, and the growth in the natural world mimicking the growth in the human world. In this particular sonnet, there's a reference to a stage, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows. Obviously, Shakespeare is known for his stagecraft. And he was a popular poet during the time. He had respect and esteem during the time, and he earned a very good living based on the scholarship that was done. That's oftentimes unusual for artists, where oftentimes they achieve their fame after their death. But this reference, this deliberate reference to stage, is kind of like a wink and a nod. And it has a term. It's called metadrama, where you are drawing a direct reference to the idea that you are watching drama. Now, of course, a sonnet isn't drama, but anybody who is reading a Shakespearean sonnet is going to think of Shakespeare as a dramatist. So, of course, he's making a deliberate reference to drama. And we'll see this in A Midsummer Night's Dream, when there is a drama embedded within the actual drama. That's very meta. Some of the themes that we see over and over again in Shakespeare include aging, which is what we see in this particular sonnet, that there is no necessarily moment of perfection that will last for an eternity. Ultimately, there will be some descent. There's a rise, and then there's a fall. It almost reminds me of the rise and fall, the pyramid structure that we can expect of a Shakespearean play, where Act 1, at the bottom left-hand side of the pyramid, establishes character. Act 2, when we are beginning to ascend the pyramid, that is the beginning of conflict. Act 3, which is the tip of the pyramid, that's the height of conflict. Act 4, the beginning of descent, and then finally Act 5, and that would be on the right side of the bottom of the pyramid, and that is resolution. And in some ways you can say the life cycle and the vegetation cycle, the natural cycle of our world follows that as well, where there is ascent and then ultimately descent. So humanity parallels the natural world. And that things aren't constant. Things are under constant flux or change. This is also another theme that we will see with Shakespeare. Notice the use of capitalization in this sonnet about time and decay. Usually we capitalize proper names. This idea of capitalizing time and decay gives these entities the sense of personification, human qualities to inhuman or inanimate objects. That time and decay are kinds of enemies, if you will, against us, as they lead to the beginning of descent or aging. And this idea that I engraft you new, you renew by grafting or implanting, in this instance by implanting through verse, which is what's very interesting about this poem, is that the subversive element of it, and again, it may not necessarily be that obvious, is that poets have the power of gods to immortalize through verse. And that could be considered quite subversive, that a poet is comparable to God, especially when you think about the chain of being. And not just a poet, specifically one poet, Shakespeare. That Shakespeare has the ability to immortalize through his language. And that's probably best stated in Sonnet 18, or the sonnet that's probably most well known of Shakespeare's. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Probably the most misread poem in literature, because people who read that poem are certain that this is a love poem to a woman. Thee means you. We are not given a particular gender. And if this sonnet is indeed Sonnet 18 and in the early set of sonnets, then it was not written to a woman. It was written to a young man, probably the Earl of Southampton, somebody who was basically Shakespeare's patron, which leads to all kinds of speculation about Shakespeare's sexuality. But as we know with Shakespearean biography, there's all kinds of speculation about Shakespeare's life. I think this is less about sexuality and more about the idea of Shakespeare wanting to flatter his patron, that this is a political move that would ensure Shakespeare's security, especially because of the subversive nature of some of Shakespeare's writings, which we will talk about next class. So what I wanted to talk about next class are the other sonnets. I wanted to also discuss the journals, because soon we will be transitioning over into when you can actually submit in some assignments, some informal responses to the works. For the journals, you're going to have some options, because we're reading, or for the sonnets, I should say, you're going to have some options because we are reading 6 sonnets. So for your first journal, you can decide to write on all 6 sonnets briefly, or you can decide to focus on 3 or 4 sonnets, or even just one in depth. And I'm thinking the journal should be about a page or so, but as long or as short as they need to be. Obviously, you could write an entire book on, let's say, A Midsummer Night's Dream, our first drama that's coming up, that I'm hoping that you are in the midst of reading, so that when we do get to that place in the syllabus, that you would have read it in its entirety when we begin to discuss it. But we will also watch performance as well, so that'll also give you some time in terms of your reading. And my hope is that while we are discussing Midsummer, you're on the next place, so that would proceed throughout the course of the semester. But once we're done with that first journal, you can see that we'd be devoting about a page or so to each of the dramas that we'd be reading. But you can write as much or as little as you like. As I said, you could easily write a book, and individuals have done that on the dramas themselves. But this will give you just a little bit of an opportunity to cite some of your observations and thoughts and questions. More than just plot, more than just what's happening, but why are those things happening? And I think the sonnets are a good way for us to sort of delve into themes that we will see over and over again in Shakespearean drama, as well as begin to become accustomed with Shakespearean language. And that's what our attendance question is for today. That'll be due in 48 hours if you're watching this on Wednesday. So that would be Friday, the 4th of February at 8 a.m. And again, if you need additional time, please let me know. And this would require you to actually watch the video on the original pronunciation versus the modern pronunciation. And which do you prefer? The original pronunciation or the modern pronunciation? And why? Notice that there is no right or wrong answer to this question. I like to ask attendance questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your thinking. And while you aren't necessarily required to respond to your peers, certainly you're encouraged to if they state something that moves you to say something in response, the way you might raise your hand in a class. But I do ask that you read all of your peers' responses and my responses to everyone in the class so that you can get a sense of the kind of discussion we would have had if we were meeting in person. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class and talk about the rest of the sonnets and begin to transition over into our first play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Take care. Bye-bye.